Well, good morning, everyone. It is an honour to be here at your interdisciplinary conference in a country whose educators are always passionate and whose culture is rich and whose knowledge is deep and who have a sense of irony that is matched only by the British and which is often needed in times of trouble and difficulty. Education is a process of transformation, always, always. What we do in education is we take something with its own nature that is roughly formed with some potential in it, and we bring out of that nature a new thing that is even more splendid than what we began with. We are, in a way, like sculptures. This is the famous English sculptor from the north of England, near where I was born, and he was inspired by the rocks in the surrounding moorland that had all been shaped and rounded by the weather. His name is Henry Moore. His sculptures are all over the world. And one of his students and contemporaries, Barbara Hepworth, you can see her sculpture outside the United Nations in New York, right at the front when you go into the city. Moore and Hepworth were not only sculptors who transformed stone into, or bronze, or metal into great works of art, but they also brought about a transformation in the nature of sculpting itself. All modern sculpture before Moore and Hepworth created space around the object. Moore and Hepworth were the first to put space inside the object. It was a transformation of the very idea of what modern sculpting was, and much contested between Moore and Hepworth about who really was responsible for this. We have in Hepworth, the feminist, perhaps the idea that a sculpture can't just be grand and big and huge and dynamic and impressive, but a sculpture can be receptive and welcoming and inclusive as well. We are in the middle, just like Moore and Hepworth, of a double transformation. Sculpting as transformation, and transformation of the nature of sculpting. We are on the edge of probably the greatest transformation of our act of transformation, the greatest transformation of public education in about 100 years. At the end of the 19th century, in most developed countries, we create what Larry Cuban and others, David Tyack, now variously call a grammar of schooling that we all accept as real schools, separate classes graded by age, students undertaking paper and pencil learning, teachers teaching from the front of the class. This is what we think of, what parents think of, as being real school. We can imagine nothing else other than this. And in about the first 10 years of the 20th century, in almost the same year in the United States and then in England, were created a set of things called the secondary education regulations in England. The American equivalent was a group of Harvard scholars called the Committee of 10, who redefined the secondary school curriculum so that it would exclude the vocational subjects at which working class children were succeeding and finding their place and their way to university. Instead, they defined the real secondary school curriculum as conventional academic subjects, history, geography, physics, chemistry, taught in more abstract ways, at which middle-class children were more effective. This deeply historical source of inequity became the second part of what we understand to be the normal, accepted grammar of schooling. High schools that are not interdisciplinary, high schools that are divided into subject departments and categories. All this is on the edge of an apparently enormous change. A change at the crossroads of the world, defined by globalization, defined by technology, defined by massive generational shifts in the way that people orient towards their own learning. What does it mean to be at this crossroads? Well, Woody Allen had a joke for it. Woody Allen put it this way: "More than at any other time in history," he said, "mankind faces a crossroads. One path leads to total despair and utter hopelessness. The other to total extinction. Let us pray we have the wisdom to choose correctly." Well, let's hope that our choice and that our crossroads is a little less tragic than the one presented before us by Woody Allen. The way to put it, perhaps, is like this: that on the one hand right now, particularly with the advent of new technologies, there is a view of education globally that is driven by what we would call short-term business capital. Michael Fullan and I, in this book, Professional Capital, which will be published by Murata shortly in Spanish, set out the argument. Capital, you know the metaphor of capital in finance, whether you are Karl Marx or Adam Smith or Warren Buffett. Capital is always about the value that is created that adds to net worth. We understand this in economics. We also understand that if you want a return from your investment in capital, you have to develop it, you have to build it, you have to accumulate it, and you have to circulate it relatively freely. This is the way that capital works in the economic sphere. No matter what your ideological position, everyone pretty much understands this. And then we began to use capital metaphorically. We began to talk in the 1960s about human capital, the idea that education was not a cost, but was an investment in the development of the next generation, who would be not only more civilized and able to participate, but with higher skills would yield greater economic returns for the society. It was an investment with a delayed return. Then we built on this metaphor through an African-American law professor, Lowry at the Harvard Law School in the 1970s, with the idea of social capital. Social capital was really not only the qualities and skills that accumulated in an individual, but how they accumulated in a group, in a community. So we know that, for example, amongst poor children, the ones who will succeed educationally better than their peers will typically have higher social capital. They will have a parent who can help them, a grandparent who can support them, a counselor at school who will be their advocate. There is a network of people that they can draw on compared to less successful ones who are more isolated. And then we developed even more metaphors of capital. In the environmental movement, we have the idea of natural capital, about how we sustainably invest in using the resources of the environment. There's even a book called Erotic Capital. I also do speeches on this. They have a much higher attendance, but they're much less but they are much less effective in their impact. Today, in the first part of the talk, I want to put before you the idea of professional capital and set it, as Michael Fullen and I have done, against the idea of business capital. Business capital in public education worldwide currently works like this. It treats education as an investment for a quick, rapid, profitable return. After the collapse of the housing market, the property market, the financial markets, capital, money, investment had to find other places to go. And one of the greatest new places of all, one of the greatest new markets, is education. Up until a few years ago, we were looking at what was happening in the world and how it affected education. Get this, education is now one of the biggest things that is happening to change the nature of the world. Multi-millionaire, billionaire Rupert Murdoch calculates that public education is a $50 billion market in the United States alone. It is a market for testing agencies. It is a market for publishing companies. It is a market for technology corporations, Microsoft, Intel, Dell, who convene meetings of global academies of ministers, policymakers, corporate leaders, the heads of large foundations around the world to set the character, the nature, the dynamic, the whole framework of global policy. And the purpose is for education to yield short-term returns as markets for these products by creating schools, as markets by creating schools for profit, by increasing private investment and control of schools in this country, in the free schools of Sweden, in the academies of England, in the charter schools of the United States, by increasing the value of education for short-term economic returns and profits for some, rather than benefit for all. This is the view, the perspective, the orientation, not yet dominant, but very pervasive, of business capital. And part of this view is you increase the profits returning to education by, first of all, displacing as much of the responsibility for education as possible from the public to the private sector, which has been the perspective of the World Bank for a very long time. And secondly, by reducing or keeping as low as possible the costs of teaching. And you keep the costs of teaching as low as possible by having a teaching force that is less well prepared, that is younger, that is not tenured, that is not pensioned, that does not stay on in the job so long, that moves on to something else like Teach for America, or Teach First in England, or Teach for China, or Teach for Chile, which I believe is now moving into Chile as well. People who prepare over short periods, give themselves a little time in teaching and then move on to something greater, presumably, in a few years ahead. And replacing teachers by technology with one laptop per child programs, virtual schooling, and in America legislating in many states, legislating that at least one high school course will have to be taken online, which of course reduce the costs of teaching and of teachers, even though there is absolutely no evidence that taking one high school course online increases or improves student achievement. This is the perspective of business capital. It is about capital, it's about a particular kind of capital. It's about ruthless competitive capital for short-term returns, with education as the place where this is played out. And it carries assumptions about teaching and teaching. The assumptions are that teaching is easy, not hard, that teaching can be picked up quickly, that teaching only requires a little training rather than a lot of training, That teaching doesn't require much extra time to prepare, but can be done mainly with your hours in the classroom. That teaching is emotionally difficult, but technically easy, because we've all seen teachers do it. How difficult could it be? That teaching is something you can do temporarily before you move on to something else, and that teachers, or much of what teachers do, is replaceable by virtual technology. The opposite to this is professional capital. The view of professional capital is that one of the purposes of teaching and schooling is, of course, to increase human returns in terms of the old view of human capital, which makes us more economically productive in the next generation by having the biggest pool of talent in terms of the complex, creative, innovative knowledge skills that we can conceivably have. This is the second view. It's a long-term view of capital investment, not a short-term view of capital investment. And it carries certain assumptions with it. The assumptions, if we want to be creative and advanced knowledge societies, are that teaching is difficult. It's not easy. It's one of the most difficult jobs there is. You'll hear me talk about Finland in a minute. If you want to marry somebody in Finland, if you're a Finn, and you're looking for a wife, the most preferred occupation for a wife in Finland is to be a teacher. If you're looking for a husband, the second most preferred occupation is to be a teacher. I'm sorry, but women, I'm afraid doctors still have it where the men are concerned. But in either case, one of the top two occupations for a spouse is to be a teacher, not just because they are dedicated, not just because the future of the country depends on them, not just because they have very high status, which they do, but because you know, when you marry a teacher, the rules of Charles Darwin prevail. You are marrying the smartest person in the room. You are choosing the gene pool for your children. This is what you are doing. So teaching, the Finns understand, teaching takes many years of preparation. It involves research, it involves understanding the details of cognition. Half of all primary teachers in Finland have strong qualifications in mathematics or in science. So science is not a second or third option, it's a fundamental part of what it means to be a primary teacher. It requires high levels of education, long periods of training, continuous improvement. You're never perfect as a teacher, you've never stopped, you always keep getting better. It requires the development of judgment when the evidence isn't clear. It's not just about the data, it's about the judgments you make about the data. It's about collective responsibility for all the children, not just about me and my class, and we'll come back to this. And good teachers will use technology well as part of their teaching, but they use it with a strong and clear view and understanding of what is effective pedagogy and how the technology can enhance that rather than replace it. These are the views of professional capital. And here's the twist. Because there are three component kinds of capital in professional capital. The first is human capital. This is your knowledge, your skills, your qualifications, your certification, your emotional intelligence, your capabilities. I prefer this term to competencies because capabilities are more about striving for excellence, whereas competence means mere adequacy. This is human capital. And in a big study in New York City very recently, a Pittsburgh business professor, Carrie Liana, looked at 5,000 teachers' results in fifth grade mathematics and correlated it with two different kinds of capital. The first was what was a teacher's human capital, their qualifications, their knowledge, etc. And she found that human capital, the better your teachers are, the better qualified they are, then the better they perform with their children. This is obvious. Less obvious was she also took measures of social capital amongst the teachers. The social capital was, how do the teachers interact with each other? What levels of trust are there in the school? How much do they trust their leader? How much does their leader trust them? How much do they share their practice, work on common projects? She took all these measures of social capital. Social capital is also related to student achievement. And here is the interesting thing. Social capital can increase human capital. You can take any group of teachers you like, get them to work together, and they will perform better than when they do not. You can become a better teacher simply by moving from one school to another. But human capital does not raise social capital. You try and educate somebody to a high level and leave them in a poor community with low levels of trust and little collaboration and poor leadership, and pretty soon they will sink to the level of the rest of the people in that community, or they will leave altogether. This is absolutely crucial. Please listen to me and to this research in this room. Any measures you have to reward individuals by pay individually, any measures you have to punish individuals by pay individually, any measures you have for principals to have the discretion to remove the 2 lowest performing individuals in their school, or the lowest 5% in their school, which is a formula created by economists who've never actually met functioning human beings in their life. If you use these measures, you're acting only on individual... Thank you, there's a bit of a delay. They seem to make so much sense. Get rid of the worst 5% and we'll be effective as everybody else. It makes so much sense, doesn't it? But you know, if you teach a class, you have 2 children in that class, and they are a pain in the neck, and you pray for them to leave. You pray for their parents to move. And you think, if only we didn't have these 2 children, I'd have a perfect class. And then one day they go, and immediately 2 other children replace them. Ones who were already there. Because this is the understanding of social capital. If you act on individuals, you will not raise the level or quality of your system. If you work on the extremes of the very worst or the very best, you will not move your whole system. We have to think about how to move a whole system forward. And this is what the highest performing countries in the world do, rather than concentrating on the extremes in a market model of rewarding and punishing individuals according to business capital principles devised by economists who don't work with human beings. So, where does this take us? This is the end of part 1. I think I have about another half hour, do I? About another half hour. Into part 2. So let's know where we've been, and then we can figure out where we're going. In a book called The Fourth Way, my colleague and friend Dennis Shirley, who's also been to Chile and speaks very good Spanish, by the way. If ever you want us to talk about The Fourth Way, bring him, not me, because he speaks Spanish, I speak this. And in The Fourth Way, we talked about 3 ways of change. These play out differently in different countries. Here's the 1960s, 1970s, when people of my age and the age of some people in this room entered teaching in idealistic terms to change the world, not only to educate individual children. And there was great inspiration here. There was a lot of innovation, and in the early days in the 1960s, there was a lot of discipline. This is the civil rights movement in the United States. Disciplined commitment to social justice. And then it turned a little later, not very long, into this. And there are also people in this room who will remember this. I am not in this picture, by the way, in case you're wondering. It turned into a similar concern with innovation, and a lot of commitment to it, but lack of coordination. There was a theory of what to innovate and what to change, but there was no theory of how to change on any scale and move it in a common direction at the same time. So innovations in education, there were many and they came from all directions, but there was no means to pull them together. And when in the 1970s money got short and the oil crisis came, and teachers began to get older and become more expensive, the first way was followed by a second way. There's one person missing in this picture. Who is that? Auguste Pinochet. Who was actually the inspiration for the other two. He's the invisible man. He's the invisible man behind Thatcher and Reagan. Their belief, informed by economists like Hayek and Milton Friedman in America, was that if the system couldn't pull itself together, we needed a couple of things to discipline it. One was the market. If we made people compete against each other, if we sold off state services to the market, they would become more efficient. The strong would survive, the weak would collapse. This happened in other areas. This should happen in what was the public sector as well. And because we could no longer trust professionals, paradoxically, we would standardize what they did. We create a centralized curriculum, more testing, more monitoring, more accountability, especially when there was little money, to prove to the public that we were providing value for money and to give them things to compete about. So there was markets and there was also standardization. The two, paradoxically, went together. You'll be familiar with this, okay? What we found at this time was not all bad. It did increase a sense of urgency. In places like the United States, it made systems pay attention to all their children whose performance had to improve. Those with special educational needs, those from cultural minorities, those who spoke second languages. Teachers now had to pay attention to all their students, not just the average of their students. There was more urgency because of this. This way is still alive and well in America, by the way, in its policy of race to the top. The disadvantages were huge. It created huge disincentives for teachers to come into teaching, to want to teach, to stay in teaching. It became harder and harder to recruit good teachers and to motivate the teachers who were already there. So in many countries, but not the United States, the second way fell away. And instead, we moved into the third way. The third way, inspired by a theorist called Anthony Giddens, a sociologist, who wrote a set of books on the third way, and politically by these three people: Gerhard Schroeder in the middle, Bill Clinton on the left, though he was less successful with it than Tony Blair on the right. The view of this, some people do say, Some people do say that I do have a slight resemblance to Tony Blair as I'm speaking at this time. So, I'd rather have my career than his, I'll tell you. And their argument was very simple, which is, let's avoid the excesses of the first way and the second way. Let's find a way that is somehow between and beyond the first two. Well, let's, with welfare, instead of giving people a handout, let's give them a hand up. As well as putting pressure on people, let's give them some support so that they can meet the pressures over time. And in education, this worked its way out in a model that looks a bit like this. And the best example of it is probably Ontario in Canada, where you'll see Ben Levin, who's been down here and worked with you, Michael Fullen, who will be coming in January to speak at the International Congress of School Effectiveness and Improvement. They won't quite present it like this, but this is essentially their model, which is an improvement on Sir Michael Barber's English model developed with Tony Blair. The idea is you still have clear goals, tests, standards at the top in fairly narrow areas, particularly literacy and math, and you are firm and you are relentless about this focus. You put everything else to the side and you concentrate on having a drive up in the test scores in this area to create public credibility, public confidence, and a sense amongst teachers that they are succeeding. The difference from the second way is that you also provide support from the bottom. You provide more pay for teachers, more time for teachers out of the classroom as well as in the classroom to be with each other, better training, more materials. So there's more pressure, it's high pressure, high support. And then in the middle, there's more interaction amongst teachers. So you have networks, you have clusters, you have inquiry projects, but not to inquire into anything you like, but to move around the policies and their implementation that have been given to you. So it's a kind of tornado. There's top-down pressure, bottom-up support, and when you interact with other teachers, it's around the stuff that you've been given to do. Are you with me? Usually around data about student performance. So that the extreme of the third way would be, we're the first actually to do independent research in Ontario with a seventh of the school districts. All the other work's been done by the advocates of Ontario. So we're the first to do independent research in 10 districts. And what we find there is moments like teachers will have, following the practices of industry, will track and monitor every single child, and every week they will meet with a chart of all the children in front of them. All teachers can see all the children. Every child is marked in terms of a red, a green, or an amber. I've seen this on the desks of large auto manufacturing companies. This is where the practice comes from. Okay? Every child is marked. If you're a green, they're okay. If they're an amber, you have to worry. They may not be up to standard. If they're a red, you're falling behind. Every week, all the teachers meet to talk about the reds and the ambers. Every week. It's relentless. It's the data. This is called data-driven improvement. The data drive what you talk about. The good news is that teachers genuinely say in the best schools, they do talk about all the children. All the children belong to all of them. They try to figure out with every child what the answer and what the response is, and they pick up problems in real time before it's too late. This is the good news about the third way. The bad news is three things, and they also occur. The bad news is teachers never talk about the greens. They only talk about the reds and the ambers. And this is because it's borrowed from auto manufacturing. And the goal in auto manufacturing is to reduce waste to zero. So you only ever talk about the defects, you never talk about the successes. If you're a teacher, this is really depressing, never to talk about your success with the greens. Make sure you talk about the greens. The second is a number of schools said, we're proud of the results that we have improved. But when we asked, what have you lost? They said, we're so serious about the literacy and the maths. We and the students have no time for anything that we are passionate about. We put all that into after-school activities because the effort is relentless everywhere else. This is the second loss. The third loss is we have charts in principals' offices that we have photographs of. And the key level, the passing level in Ontario is level 3. This is proficiency. And the Premier of Ontario, with his advisors, established a target that within one election period, 75% of students in grades 3 and 6 would reach level 3. They called this in the schools the drive to 75. So all the system is moving to get up to 75% on level 3 proficiency. There's a law called Campbell's Law from a University of Dartmouth professor, which says whenever you put an arbitrary target into a system, the system will organize itself to meet that target in however bankrupt a way as possible. In schools that we went into, the principal's charts would show the number of children on levels 3 or 4 who were at proficiency, then the numbers on 2.9, then the numbers on 2.8, then the numbers on 2.7. Are you following me? And then at the bottom, there would be a recalculation of how many 3s there would be if all the 2.7s, 8s and 9s moved to a 3. All the effort went onto the kids near the borderline, where a bit of effort would lead to a large result. The teachers said when the intervention teams came in, what about the 1s and the 2s? Because when a 1 moves to a 2, 2 is functional literacy, but it's not in the target. And the intervention teams would say, forget about the 1s and the 2s. Concentrate on the 2.7s, 2.8s, 2.9s. So the good things about the third way is it increases professionalism. It increases support. It increases interaction amongst teachers. It tracks and monitors children so things don't happen too late. These are all good things. The collateral damage, the negative effect, is often the narrowing of the curriculum because only these targets matter, and the more working class the school, the more narrow the curriculum becomes. Is the narrowing of the curriculum and concentrating efforts on some children whose scores make the overall results look good rather than on the needs of all children, which is more likely to narrow the achievement gap. So the third way holds out many great promises, don't ignore it, but also be aware of the weaknesses that come with it. What can we offer instead, beyond the third way? In the fourth way, and a new book that will be out next month, The Global Fourth Way, Dennis Shirley and I talk, so here's Chile. And here's what's going on in Chile. Just to remind you, here's what your students are protesting about. Keep the windows closed. I understand there may be tear gas later on. Here's some of your policy measures: incentive pay, performance pay, frequency of evaluation, reduction in teaching hours by 25%. By the way, when Finland had 20% unemployment and austerity and wanted to dramatically improve its education system, oh my God, 5 minutes. 5 minutes? Ish? 10. 10. I have 10. It abolished the inspection service. It decided it was better to have good teachers you could trust rather than poor teachers you had to keep checking up on. Here are some others: dismissing the bottom 5%, principal evaluation, performance-based pay. So we looked at 6 high-performing systems. I'm just going to show you pictures of them, that's all. We looked at Finland, top performer on PISA for many years, still the highest performer outside Asia. We looked at Singapore, a third world country in the 1960s with now a higher GDP per capita than the United States of America, and the highest performing country on PISA in the world. The 2 above it are not countries: Hong Kong and Shanghai. Then we looked at Alberta, the highest performing English and French jurisdiction in the world on PISA, slightly higher than Ontario, which has had 40 years of Conservative government. It supports school-designed innovation in 95% of its schools. You can have innovation and Conservative government in the same box. This is not about ideology. It's about political stability and long-term planning. Ontario, which I mentioned the good sides of, there were many fourth-way features of Ontario as well as third-way ones. You'll have to read the book to find out what they are. Outliers in the north of England that run against the tide of government policy by actually adjusting the curriculum to the artistic inclinations of Bangladeshi students, rather than squeezing the students into a standardized curriculum. And California, our most interesting one, where the teachers' union sued Arnold Schwarzenegger for $13 billion for failing to provide opportunities to learn for young people, and with the money it won, created new legislation with the government, where the union is now responsible for turning around, and has been successful over the first 2 years, turning around performance in 488 of 1/3 of the lowest performing schools in California, by giving money directly not even to principals, but to teacher leaders in those schools, in order to improve the quality and nature of teaching and learning in ways that teachers understand best. And what do we learn from these? 3 slides. Just going to pick out 1 or 2 things. First, can you see those? Some things to support you. First, if you want to be number 1 or number 7 or number 15 or in the top 20 of PISA, this is your first mistake. This is not benchmarking. Benchmarking, according to industrial benchmarking, means we look at what other countries are doing and we learn from them by connecting with what will work and what will not work in our own country. It's a learning experience. And we don't just send policy people, but we send lots of people. By saying we want to be in the top 20, we're not benchmarking. We're not benchmarking. We are bench pressing. We are, I didn't even know I could do that. We are simply showing how much we can push ourselves up compared to other people. It's a pointless exercise. Benchmarking is about learning. And when you do that, what will animate you is having an inspiring dream. For Finland, it was, after 20% unemployment, to be one of the most creative knowledge economies in the world. For California, it was to turn around a third of the lowest performing schools in California. For Alberta, it was to have an economy beyond the age of oil. All of these had inspiring dreams. Who are you in Chile? That's the question. Who are you? Thank you for the number 5. Who are you? Where are you going? Who do you want to be? If you do not know who you are, your teachers will not know, and your children will not know. Your first question is who are you? Second, less rather than more people in private education. I work in a private university, so I can't be too sanctimonious about this. There is a place for the private sector. Its job is for when the public sector does not cover certain things, and it's also to prod the public sector to move around a bit by doing something different. The private sector in education should not replace the public sector. All high-performing countries have tiny private sectors. And this means that most of the public is invested in all of the nation's children. This is what it means. The whole momentum of the public comes behind public education. It's not only me and my child. And the third one I'll point out to you here, because I'm not going to pick them all, is what E.P. Thompson, the English historian, called a moral economy. During the food riots of the 18th century in England, when the poor protested out on the streets, was because they felt there was an injustice, that when the money was tight, only the poor were making the sacrifices. They were starving, and that the moral economy, the sense of a fair share of hardships, had somehow been lost. I put it to you that whatever the specific claims of your students in their protests now, and there will be many, more likely there is a diffuse dissatisfaction that the moral economy of Chile has somehow been lost and needs to be restored for the most disadvantaged. Then there are 5 principles of professionalism, and only one more slide after this. I've talked about professional capital. I've talked about strong rather than weak unions, but strong unions focused on teaching and learning. I've talked about collective responsibility, where teachers see themselves as responsible for all the children, not just my child in my class, and have a way to share those children together. And last but not least is mindful uses of technology. We have great examples in Singapore of children using MSN Messenger as a teaching tool. With MSN Messenger, you will have icons of William Shakespeare or Isaac Newton, who will answer all the questions you can put to them that their teachers have pre-programmed. And this, it doesn't answer all the questions, doesn't answer complex questions, but it draws children's interest into the traditional knowledge of Shakespeare or Newton or Mendelevium of the periodic tables, and then they explore more deeply after that. Innovative technology can draw children into traditional learning and into traditional knowledge over time. I can give you many more examples, but it's in North America, 70% of schools ban cell phones for students because they interrupt the traditional grammar of schooling. In the schools we looked at in Singapore, cell phones are a teaching tool where Twitter is used to give instant feedback to the teacher about how shy students are responding to the learning they see in front of them. Good technology, good pedagogy go together. It's not one against the other or one instead of the other. We have to get them to work together. Last, things that hold you together are not paperwork and alignment, bureaucratic alignment. They are benchmarking with other good schools, other good countries, learning from them, using a bit of testing, but not too much. Nobody tests as much as the from the teacher education faculty meet with people in the schools all the time. People spend time in the schools, not sitting with paperwork instead. It's how much you're in each other's places, how much you move around, that really holds the system together. Constant communication. And last is like Singapore, to be able not to want everything to be aligned. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, consistency is the hobgoblin, the little devil. Consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, bureaucrats and philosophers and divines. Don't want too much consistency. In Singapore, they say, in Western culture, oil and water do not mix. In Chinese cooking, they do. They work with paradox. The art of leadership is to work with paradox all the time. So what have I tried to say to you today? I've tried to say that we are at a crossroads in the world about the whole future of public, not our individual children's education, but the education of a whole generation across the world. Will it go up for auction? Will it go for private sale? Will it go with cheaper teachers, more technology, sell-offs of schools? Is this the way we want our next generations to go? Or will it go to something based more on professional capital, unions who are progressive about teaching and learning, collective responsibility for children, prudent use of testing, with democratic engagement of the public in all or most of our schools for all the generation, not just private investment in the advancement of our particular children for our genetic benefit over time. Thank you very much for listening. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Tenemos 10 minutos para tomar alguna pregunta y lo vamos a hacer en forma, vamos a agregar hasta 3 preguntas.
Buenos días, yo soy profesor, vengo de Concepción, tengo varios alumnos sentados por allí, alumnos de la Universidad de las Américas que están acá. ¿Ok? ¿Sí? ¿Me paro?
Sí, mejor.
Aquí. Bueno, le decía que tengo varios alumnos de la Universidad de las Américas y yo clases ahí también en otras universidades en Concepción. Y yo quiero hacer la pregunta reflexiva, lo siguiente. Tenemos tantas mentes brillantes en el Ministerio de Educación, tantos pensadores como los que están aquí, pero sin embargo nuestra estructura organizativa está mutando, ¿ya? Está mutando hacia un cáncer maligno, porque no logramos que esta estructura camine. Tenemos bonitas organizaciones, pero que no están relacionadas, como decía el doctor. Estas estructuras no bajan a la sala de profesores, y no bajan. Es decir, para leer a los investigadores chilenos hay que comprar revistas, hay que asociarse a las revistas, entonces es difícil. Y lo otro es que si esta estructura es tan sólida, y también era el planteamiento del doctor Hanby, ¿no es cierto? Decía, es tan sólida y nuestra estructura es tremendamente sólida, es granítica, por lo tanto la el monumento que nos sale no nos sale creativo. Nosotros construimos monumentos sin el orificio del medio. Entonces, somos poco creativos. En nuestros discursos tratamos de ser creativos, pero en la realidad somos poco creativos. Un ejemplo, tratar de eliminar a esos profesores malos, o a los alumnos malos, a los alumnos cachos, que decimos nosotros en Chile. Y por lo tanto, si tenemos una estructura mala, nuestra funcionalidad es pésima, es peor todavía. ¿Ah? Okay, eso es lo que quería decir, y yo creo que ese es el desafío que tiene nuestro sistema educacional chileno. Mejorar la estructura y mejorar la funcionalidad de esto.
Muchas
gracias.
Gracias. Allá en el fondo alguien levantó la mano. Una sugerencia, preguntas.
Hi, mi nombre es Vania Martínez, yo soy terapeuta ocupacional. Mi pregunta tiene que ver con el concepto de capital profesional. Cuando nosotros hablamos, y lo que nosotros hablamos de alguna manera construye realidades, el concepto de capital incorpora, por lo que plantea usted, capital humano, capital social y capital decisional. ¿Cómo entiende el concepto de capital y si el concepto de capital de alguna manera no es una contradicción en función de lo que la educación busca?
Muy buenos días, mi nombre es Pedro Velázquez Rojas, sostenedor Colegio Domus Mater de Valdivia. Tuve la oportunidad de visitar Ontario a través del programa de Fundación Chile y del Ministerio de Educación, formación de directores de excelencia. Me gustaría que el profesor Andy pudiese referirse al rol que desempeña el Colegio de Profesores de Ontario, que me parece muy interesante que pueda abarcarlo en este momento. Muchas gracias.
Perdón, rol del colegio.
Del Colegio de Profesores de Ontario y su formación de estándares justamente para el desarrollo profesional.
¿Quieres saber si te reuniste con ellos? Si tuviste ocasión
Sí,
en esta visita de...
Dentro del programa estaba justamente esta visita y también a distintos establecimientos, tanto públicos como privados, y reunión con directivos y alumnos.
Brevemente, tus impresiones del Colegio de Profesores de Ontario.
Wow.
¿Quieres saber?
Si comparamos con Chile, están años luz de nuestra realidad. Es un colegio altamente profesionalizante que está permanentemente determinando los estándares de los profesores también y la certificación de estos. Me parece una muy buena iniciativa que sería bueno que él pudiese profundizar. Gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Buenos días. Mi nombre es Iván Salinas, yo soy estudiante de doctorado en educación y tuve el privilegio de leer el libro del profesor Hargreaves antes de que viniera a esta conferencia. Y también agradezco un poco que haya traído algo de esta protesta estudiantil dentro de esta sala. Yo creo que hay muchas personas que se pueden haber sentido incomodadas con el mensaje que nos entrega. Y yo quería hacer una pregunta respecto a la audiencia que justamente está acá, que se reúne, que son investigadores en educación. Yo quiero saber recomendaciones respecto a esta cuarta vía, de en qué se deberían enfocar los investigadores en educación. Y en qué cosas, esto es muy fundamental, en qué cosas no deberían enfocarse de acuerdo a esta cuarta vía, porque muchas veces esa pregunta queda fuera del aspecto de lo que los investigadores hacen y queda tomada por quienes hacen política pública y muchas veces toda esta investigación se transforma en cosas que los investigadores no tenían ni intención de hacer. Entonces, esa pregunta era la que quería hacer. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Tenemos solo 5 minutos, así que disculpa a los que están con sus manos levantadas, no vamos a tener ocasión de tomar más preguntas. Profesor Hargreaves.
Well, first of all, great questions, and thank you for those. It's bureaucracy tends to be, for the person who asked the first question, very tight bureaucracy tends to linger for 2 generations in almost all countries that have been under the rule of a dictatorship for quite some time. These are countries of many different kinds across the world, because habits of mind develop during those periods, and it is hard to change those habits of mind within particular generations. So to the extent that the question you raised is still true in Chile, I would expect and hope that you will begin to see some generational possibility of a shift there within certainly the next generation. Definitely many of the countries we look at used to be very bureaucratic. Alberta was one of the first second-way countries and has now devolved, provinces, has now devolved many responsibilities to schools. Singapore is a lot less bureaucratic than it used to be. Finland used to be highly centralized and now has its Ministry of Education consists of 18 people. In the whole ministry, 18 people. So it is possible to change. You have to want to. You need another kind of system to replace it that you're clear about. And it probably takes a shift in generations to do that. The second question was, I understand about, as a sociologist, your reservations about the concept of capital as inherently flawed in some way. But even in economics, there are many ways of thinking about capital. We've done a big study. Our next book, finished by the end of this year, is a book on high-performing organizations in business, sport, and education. And one of the business organizations is based on the belief that labor should own capital, so it is collectively and cooperatively owned, rather than the other way around. The concept of capital is still involved, but it's approached in a different way. So I don't believe the concept of capital is inherently flawed. I believe it is what you do with it, how you organize it, whose benefit it serves, that is a practical question, including the concepts of responsible and irresponsible capital, for example. The third question was about Ontario, and I'd love to talk with you afterwards. We think a lot of what has happened in Ontario is good, but we need to recognize the following things. The first is Canada as a country is one of the highest performers on PISA, but has no federal Ministry of Education. 4 provinces perform equally well. Ontario is one of those. It does not exceed the others and is slightly behind one of them. All those 4 provinces have different political control and different policies. So it's really hard to attribute, as Andreas Schleicher himself says in an OECD document in 2010, it's hard to say, and I know my colleagues Ben Levin and Michael Fulham will want to say, our policies created this, but actually 30 years of policies of different governments created what Ontario has and its sense of professionalism. And you will see that in 3 other provinces with different governments and different policies. So beware everywhere of somebody saying, we had this policy, it had this effect, now you do this policy. Because usually it's a long-term effect and it's a wide cultural question, even though I agree with everything you say about the strength of Ontario. And the last one was about research, and I think all research agendas, none less than the United States, are typically very closely tied to government policy and government strategy. Therefore, what you need on your menu of research agendas in a country is the equivalent of jazz. You need, the government is the score, and then every so often it says freak out for a few bars by yourself. And you need a part of the research agenda or organisation which is really for pure research that may or may not have any immediate or obvious connection to government policy or strategy. And I think that's probably how you protect the thing that you're asking to be protected.